All right. Hello, everyone. My name's Keith, and I'm a grateful recovering alcoholic. As Steven said from Franklin, I'm really sad my video is not working very well. If we get to any point and you can't hear me or I'm breaking up, please let me know. Hopefully, my video will kick in so I can see a few more of your faces. But I really appreciate the opportunity to share. Stephen, thank you so much, and thanks for your service through the Daily Ponderables. Um, been receiving them for I think about 8 years now, so it's a great thing to see in the inbox every morning and browse through and read. So, well, I feel I have blank gray squares, so this is really weird. I've never encountered this before, so I feel like I'm speaking to an empty room. uh, so I'll trust that you're there and you can hear me. Again, I'm Keith. I'm alcoholic. My sobriety date is December 14th of 2012. And that date just so happens to be the day of the Sandy Hook school shooting, if you guys remember that. And I mentioned that because I only really kind of just put that together maybe a year ago or less. And it really made me realize how checked out I was because that day after my last drink, I definitely have no recollection that that tragedy had occurred. And I know that I even went to a concert that evening because I remember how miserable I was at that concert on my sobriety date. And I know that at some point in that concert, they mentioned that you wouldn't have that big of a tragedy and not mention it. It was even a Christian concert. And so, and I don't really remember that. I just remember being miserable. So it's just kind of an interesting aside for me that these things get revealed even years into our sobriety. At least for me, keep things keep showing up that help me remember the significance of this disease and the severity of it. So I live in Franklin right now. I grew up in Texas. I was born in Dallas. My mom was 17 when I was born, and her dad was very active in the church. I was not planned, which is probably almost needless to say, I guess, that when your mom's 17. But I mentioned that for a few reasons. I ended up I was adopted at birth. Adoption is a beautiful thing. I have two adopted boys myself, and it's also very complicated. And as an adopted child, I can validate that there's a lot that we go through, but it's not. The good news, it's not very dissimilar from what I hear a lot of alcoholics describe in the room. I've heard alcoholics even say that they thought they might be adopted. So I think that feeling of separateness and everything is nothing unique to me. So but I was adopted, and I also am going to tell a few things, highlight, not highlights, maybe lowlights from my childhood, because I realized when I got sober that the feelings that I had from these childhood events, these major childhood things in my life, were the same feelings I was having as an adult that I was really trying to medicate with alcohol and stay away from. Um, I'll pause right there and give a couple things that I usually like to say at the beginning of my story, one of which is one of my favorite quotes from the big book from the story Freedom from Bondage. She says, alcohol was not my problem, it was my solution. And for me, that's very true. And alcohol was one of many solutions for me. My alcoholism's uh, probably by a lot of definitions isn't true textbook medical alcoholism, but thanks to enough parts of the big book, like more about alcoholism and our third tradition, I know I belong here. I'm still waiting. I still, of course, don't feel like I belong anywhere, so that shows up in AA as well. And but thankfully, our third tradition reminds me that all I need is a desire to stop drinking. I don't have to have a certain resume for my drinking or a great drunk along, which I do have enough of one, but I don't have what seems to be described as the physical allergy, and that's okay because I've seen alcohol still destroy my life, and destroy my mind and my heart, and keep it pushed down. So again, so I was adopted, and then I was adopted into a very dysfunctional family, a very scary household. I'll say that. And my mom was major rageaholic, very temperamental, to use a light word. Um, and and even my mom was so big that I forget that a lot of my early memories of feeling very scared were with my dad. I think those kind of disappeared. My mom like got bigger, and my dad kind of disappeared, even though they stayed married. But and so my I was scared of my dad from early years, and then became more and more scared of my mom as well. And never suffered any direct physical abuse, but it was always I always felt like I was this close, and I was just terrified of her. She would yell at me, um, and she said some things about my adoption that really pushed down some things that are um, really precious to an adopted child's heart. And so I wasn't made to feel safe about that. So I grew up with a lot of fear. I grew up with a lot of loneliness. Um, I grew up with a lot of big guilty conscience. I think this is common for adopted children that we like. I felt like I really um, had this huge invisible. I called when I got to treatment. I saw it's like this invisible invoice that I had my whole childhood growing up that I felt like I was constantly having to pay back for just the privilege of being in a good home growing up. So it didn't feel like a gift. It felt like an obligation. Like it felt like something I had to earn for my whole life. So that was a lot of pressure, which added to the fear. I met that fear with a lot of performance, good grades, etc. And then at age 15, I met that fear and insecurity with alcohol. Discovered that at a friend's birthday party when I was 15 years old, and it was just the greatest thing that had ever happened to me. It felt so incredibly good. I felt light. I was thinking tonight, it wasn't my shame. My insecurity was so big that even when I first drank, I remember still having some of the feelings, but they were at least manageable, like those feelings of insecurity. I remember getting picked on that night that I wasn't inhaling a cigarette, and so I still had insecurity, but it was manageable. And all I know is when I got back to sobriety, I couldn't wait to experience that feeling again and feel light again and feel like I wasn't smaller than everyone else, which I was physically too, by the way. So I'm a pretty small person. Um, so alcohol took off from that point. I somehow uh, I think my insecurity really drove me a lot to still perform and perform and perform and do kind of well in life. I made really good grades. I was salutatorian in my high school, um, and yet but I was drinking every weekend. And didn't during the week, but on the weekends it was all bets are off, and I continued that through college, and of course it increased during the week, um, and uh, and again in college I was so driven and afraid. I've heard a lot of alcoholics share about our strong will, and it's weird to be an alcoholic and say that I had a will that was strong enough that I somehow managed, even though my life was unmanageable emotionally and spiritually, I somehow managed to um, get through college and get accepted to dental school, go to dental school, drinking during dental school. So I was going to say something. Yeah. Anyway, I'm still surprised I could do that. And my drinking during dental school started to taper off as things got harder, and And then I ended up getting married during dental school, and we had our first child, and she was a surprise. And when she came, that's when I can first look at it and say, okay, my drinking took a little decline. So felt a lot of responsibility, felt a lot of fear, and maybe it was just happenstance, but there's all these times where my drinking was doing this. And as I've heard in this program, I love that people have said this because this has applied to me too. People said, I could always stop drinking, but I couldn't stop starting. And that's very much my story with alcohol. So I've had periods in my life where alcohol's just been up and down, but inevitably I kept. Oh, what I was going to say a minute ago is, as I was thinking about this talk, I was thinking, I may not be the best case for what alcoholism looks like in the sense of like that whole thing. I listened to the speaker this weekend, and he was saying he had this plan to drink 3 beers and go home, and it worked for one night, and then like the next night he he like woke up 3 days later in Amsterdam, and I don't have that kind of story. I have periods where I was a daily drinker, but I was drinking like 2 beers a day. I drank 2 beers hundreds and hundreds of times. So I could really convince myself of that I'm not an alcoholic. But here's the thing is I may not be the best case of what alcoholic drinking looks like, but I'm an excellent case for what untreated alcoholism looks like. And I'm a great case, I believe, for what the family disease of alcoholism looks like, because how it messed with my mind and my heart and my spirit, and what it did to my family, what it's done to my kids, is not any different than anyone else. That is for dang sure. Um, so my drinking went down a bit, went back up. Had this variance, never left it. The biggest turning point for me, um, the first time, this I guess I would call my first bottom, is I almost was drinking at a conference one weekend, and I came just this close to having an affair that weekend, and came home. It scared the crap out of me. I didn't talk about it with anyone at all. Buried it, and this wasn't even a conscious decision. Like, I was still so terrified in my life. I was still so disconnected from myself, from my body, my mind, my spirit. It's just so disconnected that I didn't even think about it. Like, it just immediately got pushed down to where, well, that didn't happen. We're not going to talk about it. I was really drunk, whatever. Didn't even cross my mind. Now, about a year later, or several months later, I had a bit of a religious experience, as you might call it. And, I heard something on the radio that really made me realize I needed to change some things, and I made some big changes, and gave up another survival skill of mine that we won't talk about, but let's just say the inventory's in the fourth step, right? So I made some changes in that way. I got pretty dang religious, which was definitely a good alternative to drinking. It didn't work in the long run, but it helped at the time. Started reading my Bible every day. I started waking up early and praying, and that really did change my life. Like, I think just that act of getting up in the morning. So as someone who didn't go into the program at that time, I still can say that our 11th step is probably still saved my life, even though I wasn't in the program, and I would still want to drink again. I did stop drinking for a little bit again, and turn my life around to some degree as best I could. And not surprisingly, when this happened, I got pretty damn depressed. And I started having suicidal thoughts for the first time since high school, and had enough courage to ask for a little bit of help. But long story short is I just wasn't ready. And I hate that about this disease, that we're not ready until we're ready, because, now I have friends in their 20s struggling with this type of thing. And it'd be so great if we could just do one confrontation and they'd come in the room and stop. But, that's not how it works. And so I wasn't ready. And when I say I wasn't ready, I mean, at this point, I still wasn't drinking. I had given up this other big survival skill of mine that was very damaging. But when I went in to talk to a counselor, I didn't say anything about the affair. I didn't say anything about having just given up this other survivor, so um, this sexual thing that I had that I'd been, a part of since I was a teenager. I didn't say anything about those. I just said I'm miserable and I was so scared and shut down that I couldn't use any more words. He did touch in on my childhood and my mom and what it was like for me growing up with her, and he sent me to Al-Anon. And so I went to one Al-Anon meeting, and I was like, "What the hell does this have to do with anything?" And I was too scared. I was out. So that was it. Now all this time I'm still miserable. I'm coming home from work every day. I'm about to quit my career. I couldn't stand, like I said, I think I said a minute ago, I went to dental school. I became a dentist, which for an insecure person is not the best career choice because everyone just, hates me. And first thing everyone says when they meet you is, "Oh, I hate the dentist." And I couldn't handle. I had so much of my own fear and insecurity that I couldn't have any space for my patients to have fear too, and it just wore me down and wore me down, wore me down. And so all I could think to do was run away, which is kind of what I did. And so I was pretty much ready to quit my career. My wife at the time had this wild hair to do mission work, and so we ended up becoming missionaries. We did our first mission trip and went through a discernment process, and I ended up doing mission work for the next 8 years. Which we talk about geographic fixes. This was a pretty big one. As we ended up in West Africa for 8 years, and so unbelievable work. I do want to take this opportunity to say that service work is a great way to help ourselves and help others in early sobriety, but just like anything else, it doesn't deal with the core issues that the steps will deal with. And in other words, at this time in my life, I think I was using service work as a drug. And it worked, like everything else, it worked pretty well for a while until it stopped working, just like everything else. And so towards the end of my time there, I hadn't been drinking, and I had there was a cultural thing in West Africa with drinking where the local Christians don't drink. And so I was like, it was so easy to feel self-righteous. And at the time I wasn't drinking, and I'm like, like now my organization actually allowed us to drink if we wanted to. You could have a couple beers with dinner, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, oh no, I'm not doing that. Like, I'm better than that. They don't drink here. I'm going to be just like the culture. Well, that lasted about 2 years, maybe three. And then I started having those two beers with dinner. And then, again, my drinking didn't take off and skyrocket like crazy, but it came back in as another survival skill. And I started using it again. And over the course of those 8 years, it was going further and further up. And it worked a little bit, but I think at this point it had already stopped working. But I still tried it as much as I could to try to get some relief. And I'm just trying to get relief from this pain. At this point, I could at least articulate that I had this pain in my chest. But that's about all I could do with my emotional and spiritual pain. So when I wasn't drinking, I had this pain. It was very severe. It turns out most of that pain was anxiety, which could be my primary addiction, that I just wrote myself a prescription with alcohol when it turned up and got bad enough. While I was there, I lost both of my parents. My adopted parents both died during that time in 2008, 2009, while I was working in West Africa. And so I'm surprised I was even able to cry. I was able to be with my dad when he passed away. We made it back all the way from West Africa, and he died 13 hours later, and I was able to hold his hand when he died. And I cried my guts out. I mean, like, I still can't believe it, because up to this point, tears had been inaccessible for the most part, for years and years. I think I cried when I was about to quit my career because I felt like I'd wasted all these years. And apart from that, I don't even know if I'd cried once since I was, who knows, 14, 12, I don't even know. And I had a lot of that pinned up. So Had some tears when my dad died, had some tears when my mom died, but I wasn't even close to tapping into the amount of grief that I had about my parents, about losing them, about my adoption. And so when they passed away, I remember feeling just so utterly alone in the world. It was almost unbearable. And what I didn't know until I got to treatment and sobered up is that a lot of that aloneness was a loneliness for my birth parents. And see, I had that pushed down by my adopted mom, and I pushed it down myself um, because I was so afraid of her and afraid of my feelings. So I had pushed all that down, stuff, and alcohol helped for a bit with that until it stopped working. So eventually came home from West Africa, where I was already starting to get really miserable again. When it was time to come home, we came home for my son's education. He had some learning disabilities, and so we had to come home and kind of retire our mission career and then get him some specialized education. And I remember at the time, thinking, okay, this is it, you know. Um, Another of course I wasn't saying this, but it's like another geographic fix, this will do it, like it's the stress of West Africa, it's how horrible it is here, you know it's all that I've been through the last 8 years, it's this, I'll get back to this normal American life and I'll be fine. Of course at other times I'm sitting there at my desk drinking a beer and going, I'm really afraid that when I move back to the United States I'm going to become an alcoholic. Little did I know I already was one. But I came back home and being amongst my peers, trying to figure out what to do with work again, trying to figure out if I was going to practice again, get a normal job, try to continue in this nonprofit work or what. I crashed and burned very, very quickly. And my low point a few months later, something had happened with my wife at the time, and she was upset, which was one of my biggest triggers for me. And I'll explain more. I don't want to just use the word trigger and not explain what was happening. But you know, if anyone was upset with me before I was in recovery, I just knew that something was wrong with me. And so I shouldn't even say upset with me. If anyone was upset, it was just a reflection of how bad I was. It was a reflection of how flawed I was. It was a reflection of what a piece of junk I was. And sometimes, and the the funny thing about that kind of insecurity is that I found in treatment is it's also very grandiose, and so it's sad and it's laughable at the same time. It's like I'm a piece of junk, but you don't get it. I'm like the biggest piece of junk there is, and it's just funny how much grandiosity there is in that insecurity, and it's also very narcissistic. Like my wife is upset. Like I don't think to ask her, hey, what's going on? Maybe it has nothing to do with me, but I make it all about me, and it goes all internal. And my son starts crying because she had to bring him with her and all this, and so I'm just like swimming in my shame and my fear and my insecurity of what a piece of junk I am because my wife doesn't like me and God doesn't like me. And that was really the real bottom, was when I finally had this guttural, visceral feeling that God just doesn't like me. He doesn't approve of me. He's not for me. If he was, my wife wouldn't be upset. These are the crazy thoughts that I had. And in that moment, that fear was so great that I before I knew it, I punched the windshield of my truck. It shattered. I got out of the truck and I think it looked like I had seen a ghost. And I just uttered the words. I just punched the windshield of my truck. So that was my low point, and from that point, had already started getting some help because I was suffering with some depression. Um, but that kind of catapulted things into a whole new place. And the fact that I had started to get help is probably why all that stuff was coming up, because I had started to talk about some of my abuse that I suffered from my grandfather and things like this. So I was raw, alcohol wasn't working, and I was depressed. And a few months later, I ended up checking myself into treatment and stayed 3 months. And I'm a big advocate for treatment over over 30 days for sure. I think a 90-day treatment is a great option if anyone can do it anyway. Um, so when I got to treatment, again, alcohol didn't seem like my problem. And it would take me a while to see that it was one of many solutions. And my problem, I have a meeting that I go to, and we have a reading called The Problem and the Solution. And what I love about the reading that has the problem is it says we felt, well, I'll tell you what it doesn't say. This is one thing I love about it, is it doesn't say, oh, we drank too much. That's the problem. I mean, what more do we need to say? That's not what the problem says. The reading of the problem starts out, we felt inadequate, unworthy, alone, and afraid. And I love that. And so that's what I discovered when I got to treatment, is just how much that was true for me. Um, the difference that recovery has made for me in the steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, the 12 steps, is it's uncovered these words that meant absolutely nothing to me. Resentment, I had no idea what resentment was. And I remember when I was in treatment, that counselor that I mentioned, seeing like 10 years before that, he asked me, he said, do you think, you resent your wife? And I was too ashamed to admit that I didn't know what a resentment was. And so I just said, no, I don't think so. And so these things are just taking shape for the first time, to actually see and feel what a resentment is, that I have them, the real, to step into my insecurity and my shame, these things that are really dug up in the fourth step, to really dig into my fears too. That was the other one. Those three things to me are so crucial to what the 12 steps offer to us. Those three things are like, they're the springboard towards my step 6, my step 7, my step 8, my step 9, step 10, that I kind of do cyclically with my life now that I'm in recovery. Uncovering those, that for me is kind of like there's what happened, which is all that I just told you leading up to punching the windshield out of my truck. But then there's the, or I guess that's what it was like, what happened, also punching the windshield out of my truck. But what happened wasn't just being so low that I had to go to treatment, but what happened, my biggest gratitude again is those things that I never knew were going on inside of me, how much fear I had, how much insecurity I had, and how much resentment I had. So, and then feeling feelings for the first time. So went to treatment, was there for 3 months, uncovered a lot. What I found for me, there's 2 words that I wish were in the big book a little bit more. And those 2 words are grief and healing, because I experienced a lot of those 2 words when I was in treatment and after I got out. I had a lot of grief about my story. I had a lot of sadness. For me, how that fits into the big book is through the acceptance, the chapter on acceptance, or the story. Acceptance was the answer. If I'm not, if I'm not sad about something, I don't really have to work very hard to accept it, because I'm fine with it. But I had a lot. I had basically spent my whole life running from sadness, of any shape or form, because it reminded me of all the sadness that I had been stuffing my whole life. And so grief is really the place for me that I found acceptance, and I cannot believe how much it lifted from me. And so my experience, I haven't heard many people with this experience, but I pretty much spent time grieving and crying a lot every day for almost 2 years. And I love sharing that, because I don't know how you hear that, but if I were on the receiving end of that statement, I would kind of think, well, that sounds terrible. But it's actually one of the greatest things that's ever happened to me, to be able to access those tears that readily, to grieve my adoption, to grieve not knowing my birth parents, to grieve what was done to me by my grandfather, like all these things. As I share this, I'm going to share the fear that I have of talking about my childhood in AA. I think most people end up delving into that. I know that a lot of people have a lot of fear about getting stuck there, but what my experience was that I was stuck there. in not looking at it and not dealing with it and not feeling what I needed to feel about it, I was stuck there, and that kept me drinking, and that kept me insane. And if I wasn't drinking, I was jumping to work, I was jumping to something else, staying busy, not knowing how to relax. So that's a little bit of what it was like and what happened. What it's like now. Um, the other funny thing about the problem where it says we felt inadequate, unworthy, alone, and afraid is what it's like now is I feel inadequate, unworthy, alone, and afraid. The difference is that it's a little bit less than it was, or I should say it's a lot less than it was. Um, and I'm sitting in a meeting with, let's see how many participants are on here, 166 people. Okay, now this feels like a bad idea, but I'm sitting here in a meeting telling my story, talking about how I felt and I feel inadequate, unworthy, alone, and afraid. So that's the difference. And I never thought that friendship and attachment with other people, and especially other men, would be based in calling my sponsor and calling my good friends in AA almost every day and saying, hey, I'm really scared about this. Hey, that old fear that I'm not enough is coming up. Hey, that old fear that all these 166 people aren't going to like me and are going to laugh at me. Hey, called my sponsor before this and said, I think I have this fear coming up that I'm going to be blackballed from AA and I'm never going to be able to share my story again. Sharing that with another man is an unbelievable building of friendship that I never thought could happen in that such a way. I mean, I would have thought that's completely silly, and I would have thought that once was enough. And this program shows me that I need help, that I can't do this alone. This program also shows me that I don't know what's best for me. That's another one of my favorite parts of Acceptance is the Answer story, when he says, if I don't know what's best for me, I don't know what's best for you or anyone else. And as time goes on, I start to see a little bit more of what's best for me, but it's mostly because made so many phone calls that I hear your voices and I hear my sponsor's voice and my friends' voices, and it's a real gift. And so I feel like it's not my voice anymore that's leading the way, that self will. It's the voice of the program and my higher power working through them. I really thought that when I went into treatment that, if I just said a quick prayer, well, then obviously I was just going to do God's will. My higher power made it very clear when I was in treatment and I got into this way of life that um, that He wants to work. And I say He, I don't know if my higher power is a He or what, but I'll just use that as it's most common. But that my higher power wants to work through other people, and I need Him to work through other people. I need that practical feedback. I need that perspective. I need to hear sometimes that there's no right way to do things, that I just need to go out and do it and surrender the results. And so that's a big difference for me. I forget, like, again, every time I share my story, I'm reminded of something that I'm so grateful for. I forget that contrast between how little I taught. Like, let's take my early career. I graduated from dental school. I'm practicing. I'm struggling with work. I talked to no one about anything going on in my life except to bitch at my wife when I got home from work. Um, Now I have a way of life where I can call men every day and talk about the smallest, most minute things if they're getting to me and they're bugging me. And it's such a gift. I talk about everything going on in my life all the time, and that leaves me, a more it leaves me a more filtered, um, sometimes sometimes more filtered version of myself to bring to my wife and to share myself and process things. And sometimes it's unfiltered, and that's okay. We get clumsy, but what it's been like since treatment, I want to name a couple of the hard things just because life is still really tough a lot of times. Um, and I want to say this not because my life is so tough. I want to say this to say how powerful this program and the steps are. I still believe I'm powerless over alcohol, and that's a very scary thing for me. I'm really scared of the concept that I have no mental defense against the first drink. And yet I am shocked by the miracles of this program. So I did get divorced after I went to treatment. I guess that was about 3 years after I went to treatment. The divorce took a year and a half. It was long and brutal, and I ended up with very little custody of my kids just because I needed to work. And anyway, I won't get into all the details on that. My youngest son um, he was adopted, like I said, had some severe emotional and psychological issues. And he has actually been in treatment. He ended up, we ended up having to place him in therapeutic foster care. I had to surrender my rights with him, or at least surrender my time with him when I was almost up to 50% custody. And then my ex-wife actually ended up putting him into therapeutic foster care. So that process has been extremely, extremely difficult. And I say all that to say that I didn't drink through any of that. And it's definitely not to say I didn't think about it. And so part of the gift of this program is I can be honest when I wanted to take a drink. The obsession is gone. That doesn't mean the temptation doesn't show up every now and then when things get tough. So I've seen a lot and been through a lot, even in sobriety, and I messed up a lot, But I'm super grateful that I'm able to take risks that I didn't take before, like in business, and not just beat the heck out of myself. Like that's a big part of courage and sobriety for me. I'm grateful to have remarried to another alcoholic who's 13 years sober now, and we have a grandbaby. So I don't know what else to share. Have a little bit of time left, and maybe one or two people want to share how they've heard something they can relate with this in this. But I will say again, I'm just really grateful for this way of life and what the steps have shown me, and I love being able to pass along what I've been given, and the patience that this program gives me with my sponsees, my kids, people who are still entering into this way of life. And it's going to take them a long time to get there, just like it took me, and it's still taking me. And it's the gift of waiting is a big gift of the reduced anxiety that I've experienced, not through stopping drinking, because stopping drinking only made it worse. But the actual steps and the process of the steps, the grief that I talked about to you, and the healing that I've gotten through the steps, continuing to meditate. I'll say one last thing. How about I close with this? Meditation has come to the forefront of my attention again in the last few weeks, I guess. And I've been meditating for about 8 years now as instructed by our steps. And I do so first thing in the morning, and I take about 20 minutes to do it. And I learned, it's funny, like even after practicing that long, my wife came to me the other day and she's like, you're increasing your tolerance for pain by doing that. And I hadn't heard that. She said, every time you meditate, your tolerance for pain is going up and up and up. And I don't, so I do think meditation is extremely important, but I think that's such a great picture of what the program and steps and support and going to meetings and entering back into the disease. I was at a detox center this weekend and did a meeting, and entering back into that early stage of powerlessness, and like, oh my gosh, it was really difficult. I had to struggle with my higher power about that. It was a degree of pain, but again, because of being sober, I had to get my story to get sober, and I had to get my story to stay sober, and all that's for me about tolerating pain, which is what I was terrible at before. So that was kind of a random ending, but I'm going to wrap up there. And then if we have a minute, if anyone wants to share, that's kind of what we do at my home group. I didn't leave you a lot of time, but I appreciate you listening. Thank you so much. And it's an honor to be with you guys this evening. Thanks.